My son unexpectedly invited me to supper after not calling for months. A reservation at the priciest restaurant in town, not just any meal. He even promised to come get me. When Miles smiled warmly and held the door open for me that night, I should have known something was about to happen since he was never one for surprises, and most definitely not for affection. However, I didn't. I relaxed. My first error was that. That week, the wind had already begun to bite. In our small Nebraska town, the air was usually crisp in early November. When the phone rang, I had just finished putting firewood near the porch. I nearly didn't answer. Usually it was the churchwomen or the drugstore, but this time it was Miles. His voice was quieter than normal, almost informal. Said that he and Trina decided it would be pleasant to buy me supper for the three of us. I stopped. Miles never made such a suggestion. He was constantly occupied and preoccupied. What about Trina? She wasn't cruel, but no matter how many holidays we spent together, she had a coldness that never really went away. Nevertheless, I accepted the offer for some reason. It may have been the loneliness that had been creeping up on me recently, like dust on the old quilt at my bed's foot. Or perhaps it was that glimmer of optimism that you never ever get over, that your child at last wants to view you as family rather than a burden. I was picked up shortly before dusk. Trina was wearing a camel-toned wrap jacket, which she always wore like armor, and Miles was wearing a clean wool coat. The polished wood and gentle amber light illuminated the diner. Genuine silverware and linen napkins. It was the nicest place I'd been in years. For me, Miles opened the door. With an unusually warm grin, Trina removed my coat. She gave my scarf a compliment. I let myself think for a second that this was true, that maybe something had changed. Perhaps they were starting to notice me once more. We took a seat at a table in the corner. A bottle of red wine was brought by the waiter. My drink was poured by Miles himself. He persisted even after I assured him I was okay with just water. It was a celebration, he claimed. I grinned, but something inside of me stirred, a long slumbering part of me suddenly awake. Even though I told myself it was simply jitters, I knew deep down. There was a problem. The wine had a smooth, long-lasting plum aftertaste, and it was older than I had anticipated. Miles filled it to overflowing even though he knew I wasn't a big drinker. I sipped and thanked him. His smile fell short of his eyes. When she wanted something warm enough to appear courteous, but far enough away to keep you wondering, Trina, who was seated opposite from me, wore the same subdued face. The waiter arrived and departed. The starters showed up, a bowl of creamy soup with wild herbs, followed by a beet salad with goat cheese. Trina questioned how I was sleeping these days as she leaned closer. With a little bend of her head, she said in a blanket-soft voice, I told her half of the truth. Sometimes the nights were too quiet. While he listened, Miles generally let her speak. He was concentrating on the cuisine, making choices for dessert and inquiring about wine pairings. Seeing them like this together was odd. There was a rhythm to the way their eyes met, like exchanging notes in class, even if they weren't visibly amorous. The atmosphere had changed by the time the main course, roasted carrots and braised lamb, arrived. Trina's voice brightened, almost thrilled. She inquired as to whether I had recently visited the lake. Not since late summer, I answered. She gave a nod, almost in agreement. It would be such a lovely location for small events, she continued, turning to Miles. Health weekends, retreats, and weddings. I took a while to reply. Miles slowly and evenly sliced his steak as I watched. He did not shake his hands. Mine did. Trina continued talking about the cabin's prospective restoration and natural lighting. She brought up her acquaintance who had a boutique hotel company in Omaha. The property was a gift, and gifts were to be shared, she continued with a smile. I set down my fork. Something inside of me stopped talking. Miles took a folder out of the pocket of his coat as the dessert arrived. It contained neatly cut, pre-highlighted pages. Speaking simply, he stated that they had consulted a few experts only to get inspiration. We could begin the procedure earlier if I signed now. No pressure, of course. Trina added that I could still live there. They wouldn't change anything without asking. It was just a formality, legal housekeeping. The light above us was golden and soft, but everything inside me felt cold. I looked down at the paper. My name was already typed. And that's when I realized I wasn't invited to dinner. I was summoned. I sat back, letting the sweet scent of dessert drift past me. The table had gone quiet, except for the faint clink of Trina's spoon against her crème brûlée. Miles reached across the linen and slid the folder closer to me. His tone was even almost soothing, like he was offering a warm towel instead of a legal document. He began explaining the basics, calling it a simple deed transfer. Just to tidy things up, he said. Something smart to do before winter. His words were so carefully chosen, each one designed to sound harmless. He didn't look up as he spoke. Trina did. Her eyes were steady on me. I didn't touch the papers. My hands stayed folded in my lap. He said that with the land in his name, they could manage taxes better. He mentioned legacy planning, the benefits of consolidating ownership. He said my name would still be on record, just not the primary title. Trina nodded along, offering quiet affirmations. It was all rehearsed. I asked what the rush was. Miles chuckled, said there wasn't one, but the way he leaned forward, elbows on the table, told me otherwise. Trina chimed in again, her voice gentle but with an edge. She said she'd already spoken to a local planning consultant just in case. The town she claimed was considering rezoning lakeside property. It would be wise to act before anything changed. That word act lingered in the air. I opened the folder slowly. The top page had my full name typed out in bold. The next page listed the parcel number, the coordinates of the land, and a brief clause stating transfer of ownership in full. There was a highlighted line near the bottom. I could still reside on the property, but all development rights would be under Miles. There was a signature line waiting for me. Just one. I closed the folder without reading further. My breath was steady, but my chest felt tight. I told them I wasn't feeling well. Trina's expression didn't falter. She touched my wrist lightly and said we could do this another time. Miles smiled, but I noticed how his jaw tightened. His hand was still on the folder when I stood up. The waiter returned with the bill, and Miles waved it away with a practiced gesture. He stood to help me with my coat, polite to the very end. As we stepped outside, the wind cut through the November air like a warning. The parking lot was nearly empty. I heard the soft scrape of my boots on the pavement. In the car, no one spoke. Miles drove me home, headlights slicing through patches of fog. When we reached my porch, he asked again, almost too casually, if I would think it over. I nodded. He leaned in and kissed my cheek. Trina stayed in the car. Inside, I set the folder down on the kitchen table and stared at it. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I walked to the living room and sat near the window. The lake, barely visible through the trees, shimmered faintly in the dark. That land had been in my family for 3 generations. My late husband used to say it held more memory than soil. I had always believed that. Now I wondered if my son had ever believed it at all. The next morning, I woke up with a tight ache across my chest. Not from the food, from everything else. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on my knees, staring at the soft light that crept through the curtains. The room felt colder than usual, even with the heater humming. My old slippers worn at the edges felt like the only steady thing beneath me. I moved slowly, like my body understood something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. At breakfast, the coffee was bitter no matter how much sugar I stirred in. I didn't feel hungry, though I made toast out of habit. I chewed through it like paper. My thoughts kept circling back to last night's dinner. The way Miles avoided eye contact after sliding the documents forward. The practiced tone in Trina's voice. The way her hand settled too comfortably on that pen beside the folder. That dinner hadn't been about family, it had been a transaction, and I was the asset on the table. I told myself I was being dramatic, that maybe they just wanted to prepare for the future. But the unease in my gut said otherwise. It wasn't just the request, it was the way they had looked at me as if they already considered it done. By noon, I stepped out onto the porch. The lake was calm, mirror smooth. A thin line of geese moved across the water like black stitches across satin. For years, this house had been my quiet place, but now the silence pressed in. The trees didn't feel sheltering anymore. They felt like witnesses. I walked slowly down the back path toward the little bench at the edge of the lake. My husband built that bench the year before he passed. He used to sit there with his thermos and hum old folk songs. That spot was sacred. I sat down and let the weight in my chest settle. His voice echoed in memory. He had been clear about the land. This place stayed in the family, not for profit, not for projects, but for roots. He trusted me to carry that forward. I had always imagined one day passing it on to Miles when he was ready, when he understood the meaning. But last night had shown me he didn't want the soul of the land. He wanted its potential, its yield, its market value. When I came back inside, I walked past the hall where we kept the family photos. I paused. There was one missing, a small framed picture taken years ago of me holding a basket of lake flowers. Miles had taken it on a spring morning, said it was the most peaceful I'd ever looked. I searched the drawer where we kept the spare frames. It wasn't there either. I stared at the empty space on the wall. I didn't need to be told twice. That photo was gone, just like the part of me they no longer found useful. That night, I didn't bother making dinner. I opened a can of soup and let it sit on the stove too long. I wasn't angry, not yet, just hollow. I sat by the window with the curtains drawn. The lake reflected a thin silver crescent of moonlight. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat still as if hoping to hear his voice in the night breeze. But there was only silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Not grief, not fear, just the early rustling of resolve. 2 days later, I visited Miles's house. It wasn't planned. I had a box of kitchen tins he used to love as a boy, and I thought I'd drop them off before the holidays. Just a small gesture. I stood on their porch for a moment, holding the box, looking at the neat little wreath hanging on their door. Red ribbon, no soul. Like it had been ordered in bulk. Trina opened the door. Her smile was tight. She stepped aside quickly, barely making room for me to pass. The warmth in their home felt forced, like a house dressed up for company, but hollow underneath. I stepped inside and paused. There, on the main hallway wall, was a newly framed family collage. Glossy prints, arranged perfectly. A trip to the lake, a birthday party, a backyard barbecue. Everyone looked polished, posed effortless, but I wasn't in any of them, not one. I walked up to it, my fingers hovering over the glass. Miles stood in the center of most photos, arms slung around Trina or one of the kids. They looked happy, whole. But my place was gone, like I had never been part of the frame. Trina passed behind me, saying something about how they had just printed them last week, a surprise gift for the holidays. Her voice was soft, but it held no apology, no acknowledgement. I turned away and placed the tin box on the entryway table. Miles wasn't home. At least that's what she said. I didn't ask where he was. I didn't want to hear another excuse that would twist in my chest for days. On the way out, I noticed a small gift pile near the fireplace. One of the boxes had a tag addressed to Grandma, but the handwriting wasn't Miles's. It was one of the kids. A card sat on top, scribbled in crayon. It said, "Miss you." I almost cried right there. But instead, I straightened up and stepped outside. The wind had picked up. It was sharp and fast, cutting through my coat. I walked back to my car with my hands in my pockets. As I pulled out of their driveway, I passed a sign for a Thanksgiving event at the local church. It reminded me I hadn't been invited this year. No one had called. No one had asked what I was doing. Usually I'd bring the stuffing or the pumpkin pie. This year, there wasn't even a mention. At home, I sat on the porch for a long while, the box of gifts still pressed in my mind. I kept seeing that wall of photos polished and cold. My absence wasn't a mistake. It was a decision, an erasure. Inside, I reached for the photo album I kept on the bookshelf. The real one. The old one. Full of snapshots in soft light, with crooked smiles and smudged edges. Pictures of Miles with jelly on his cheeks. Of my husband cleaning fish by the lake. Of Trina, before she learned how to smile with her lips and not her eyes. I flipped through it until I found the picture they had removed from their wall. The one of me and Miles on the dock when he was 8, holding a frog with both hands, his eyes wide with joy. I pulled it from the plastic sleeve and placed it in a small frame. Then I put it by the front window, where the afternoon light hit just right, where no one could take it down. It was time to remember what was real, even if they didn't. It started with a voice low and urgent floating through the window one morning. I had just come in from sweeping the porch when I heard it. The wind carried it through the open kitchen window, and I paused, still holding the broom. Trina. She was outside on her phone, pacing along the gravel path that ran between the lake and my neighbor's hedgerow. She must have thought I wasn't home, or maybe she didn't care. Her voice was crisp, clipped. She was talking to someone about permits, investors, and something called the Brenner Retreat at Loon Lake. She said the words like they were already carved in stone. I moved quietly toward the window, heart thudding. I didn't want to hear more, but I couldn't stop. Trina mentioned the last parcel. "Esther's land," she said. "Once that's signed over, we can move forward. It's the final piece." I stood there, frozen. So that was it. This wasn't about family. It never had been. That dinner, the photos, even the gift from the children, it was all a setup. A performance to soften me, to ease me into giving up the only thing I had left. Not just a house, not just a lakefront view. It was my life's ground, and they had used my own memories to market it. Trina continued speaking about branding. It's perfect. Esther used to run the women's circle. She hosted summer workshops for girls. We'll play that up for grant money. Legacy empowerment makes it more appealing to funders. She knew everything. She had done her research, and she was going to use my name, my work, my history to pave over the truth. I stepped back from the window and sat down. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a kind of cold clarity. Trina was smart, calculated, but she had underestimated me. She thought I was just old, sentimental, easy. She forgot I kept every document, every newsletter, every photo from every retreat. I still had the ledgers, the tax forms, the handwritten notes from girls who had once come to learn how to sew, to speak, to feel seen. This land wasn't just property. It was a space of memory, of care, of identity. And she wanted to bulldoze it for weddings and wellness weekends. That night, I pulled out the old file box from the linen closet. Inside were copies of every land agreement, community grant, and the original deed. My husband had signed it with a note. "This land is for Esther. Let it stay hers, and let it serve." He never trusted easy charm, and now neither would I. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I drafted a list of what I needed. Legal contacts, the name of the lawyer who'd helped my husband with our estate, community board members, women from the old circle, allies, quiet ones. By dawn, I had a plan not to fight with anger, but to reclaim what was mine with precision. Trina had her project. Now I had mine. The morning after I heard Trina's call, I brewed a pot of coffee and set the mug down next to the thick file of documents I'd pulled from the linen closet. The file smelled faintly of cedar and old ink. I hadn't opened it in years, but I knew every corner of it. My hands didn't shake this time. Mid-morning, I made the call. Harold Tilson. He was retired now, living in a quieter town north of here, but his voice still carried the same calm steadiness it had when he helped my husband write the will. I introduced myself, though I didn't need to. He remembered, and when I told him why I was calling, there was a pause. Not from surprise, but from the kind of knowing that comes with time. We talked for nearly an hour. I explained what I'd overheard, what had happened at dinner, about Trina and the plans for the land. Harold asked clear, careful questions and then gave me options. He said that the original deed was strong. My name was on it with full custodial rights. But if I wanted to be certain the land couldn't be touched or transferred, there were stronger protections. He told me about a community trust, a structure that could ensure the property remained under a defined purpose, one that aligned with the legacy my husband had written into his final wishes. If I created a trust with a board, I could designate the land for public benefit. Not only would it be untouchable by outside hands, it would serve a cause I believed in. Then he said something that landed like a quiet bell, ringing inside me. Esther, your name means something in that town. Don't forget that. After we hung up, I sat with those words for a long time. My name, my place. I'd let too many people assume I was fading, but I hadn't faded. I had simply stepped back. Now it was time to step forward. I called the community center, left a message for Diane, the director. Then I called Loretta, who used to run the local reading program with me, and Marla, who still taught workshops for older women at the Lake Library. These were women who had written grants, organized workshops, baked pies for fundraisers. Quiet power, real power. By afternoon, we had agreed to meet, not just for tea, for strategy. That evening, I drafted a mission statement. I called it the Light on the Lake Foundation, a program dedicated to supporting older women through skills training, seasonal retreats, and storytelling circles. I would fund the first phase with savings. The land would be the anchor. I signed nothing. I gave no one permission to take anything from me, but I would give something else, something far better. I would give my name, my place, my purpose on my terms. As the sun set over the lake, I lit a single candle on the windowsill. It wasn't for mourning. It was for marking the beginning of something that had been waiting a long time to rise. That Sunday morning, the church pews were filled with worn wool coats and the scent of old hymnals. The November wind had rattled through town all week, but inside that chapel, the warmth from familiar voices and soft organ chords made it feel like time slowed. I sat in the third row from the back. I had sat there every other Sunday for most of my life, but that morning something felt different. Or maybe I was just seeing it all differently now. Reverend Hatch stepped up to the pulpit, his voice even and worn from years of burying neighbors and baptizing their grandkids. He didn't preach fire or brimstone. He never had. He spoke about the small things that held us together. He read from Corinthians, then closed his Bible and said something that settled deep in my chest. Forgiveness does not mean surrender. You can love someone and still not hand them the keys to your house, your peace, or your land. A few heads turned. Some nodded. But I stayed still. I knew it wasn't meant for me alone. Still, it felt like the Lord had planted that sentence in his mouth just for me. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. What I felt wasn't sadness anymore. It was clarity. After the service, I didn't linger for coffee or cookies in the community room. I walked home with my gloves clutched in one hand, the other holding my coat closed as the wind swept through town. My steps were firm, not rushed. I passed the lake. The water was low this time of year. Bare branches clawed at the sky, but I could already imagine it full again in spring. Back home, I opened my sewing box not for thread or needle, but for the envelope tucked beneath the false bottom. It held the last handwritten note from my husband. He had written it months before he died, in his familiar, careful cursive. "You built this house, Esther. You grew the garden, taught the classes, opened your hands to everyone. If the day comes when someone tries to take what you've made, protect it. It belongs to your spirit." I read it twice, then set it aside. My spirit had been dormant too long. By late afternoon, Diane, Loretta, and Marla came over. I had set the kettle to boil and arranged old notebooks and a blank whiteboard by the window. They arrived bundled in coats, cheeks red from the cold eyes bright with the kind of purpose that only women our age seem to hold quiet and immovable. We worked for hours sketching out what the Light on the Lake Foundation would become: retreats for women in their 50s and older, writing circles, cooking classes, walks by the lake, where we would talk about everything and nothing. The land would not be sold. It would be shared wisely and with intention, as the sky turned indigo and streetlights flickered on outside. I looked around the table. These weren't just old friends. They were builders, believers, protectors of something precious. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel outnumbered. I felt rooted. And as we closed the evening with peppermint tea and plans to meet again, I knew that what I was doing wasn't just about keeping the land safe. It was about keeping something sacred alive in me. The land was mine. But now, so was the voice I had forgotten I still had. It was a Thursday afternoon when Miles and Trina showed up unannounced. I saw their car pull into the gravel path through the kitchen window. The tires crackled on the frost-dusted driveway that sounds sharp and cold. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, heart calm, but steady like a slow drum. They came in with polished smiles and too much cheer for two people who had cornered me at a dinner table not long ago. Trina wore a crimson coat with fur trim and carried a leather binder. Miles kept his hands in his pockets like a boy about to ask for forgiveness he didn't believe he needed. They sat on the couch while I stayed in my usual chair, the one near the window. The sun slanted across the room, catching dust in the air. The house smelled like pine cleaner and simmering lentils. Trina opened her binder. She spoke smoothly, too smoothly, about potential investors, tax benefits, the projected returns from converting the lake property into a boutique retreat. She laid out color-coded pages, charts, maps. Her voice filled the room, but it was hollow. I noticed how she never used the word family, never said the word home. Miles nodded along, barely making eye contact. He let Trina carry the plan, like always. Then she reached the end of the presentation. There in bold were my initials typed next to a line labeled Property Owner Approval, Signature Required. She looked up and smiled like it was already done. I didn't touch the papers. I didn't even lean forward. I simply reached down beside my chair, opened a manila envelope, and took out a single sheet. "This is from my lawyer," I said. "It confirms that the lake property now belongs to the Light on the Lake Foundation. I am no longer the sole owner, and the foundation does not intend to sell." Trina's face froze. She blinked once as if her brain was catching up to her ears. Miles leaned forward. His voice was soft, unsure. "But why? Why didn't you talk to us about this first?" I looked at him and felt the last bit of old ache settle. "Because I did, that night. And you both made it clear what you wanted had nothing to do with me. This land was never meant to be turned into something for profit. It was meant to outlive us with dignity. Trina closed her binder without a word. Her cheeks flushed, but not from embarrassment, from fury barely held back. She stood up first. Miles followed slower, his eyes avoiding mine. They walked out without saying goodbye. I didn't watch them leave. I picked up the papers Trina had left on the coffee table, glanced through them, and slipped them into the fireplace. The flames caught fast, curling the corners inward like dried leaves. I stood until nothing but blackened ash remained. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the cold through the trees. But inside, I felt warm, not because I had won anything, but because I had finally stopped waiting for them to understand. I had made peace with being misunderstood, and for the first time, the house felt fully mine. The morning of the foundation launch, the lake was quiet, draped in a gentle mist. The surface mirrored the gray sky above, still and wide. I stood on the wraparound porch with a cup of black coffee in my hands, listening to the silence. For once, it didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. The event wasn't meant to be grand. I had asked for it to remain small, intimate. Just a few members of the community, a handful of women from the senior center, the local pastor, and the lawyer who had helped me bring it all together. There were no balloons, no banners, no photographers. Only folding chairs set up beneath the sycamore tree, facing a small wooden platform, looking out toward the lake. People started arriving around 10. Women I'd taught budgeting classes to when I worked at the community office. A retired librarian who once ran the adult literacy program. A widow whose daughter had moved away and never wrote. We hugged. We smiled. Some eyes were damp before I even said a word. I stood behind the simple podium and looked out. The crowd was quiet, waiting patient. I suppose you're all wondering why I'm standing up here instead of sitting quietly at home, I said. That got a few gentle chuckles. The truth is, I spent a long time waiting for the people closest to me to understand what mattered. But what I learned slowly and painfully is that sometimes you stop waiting. You start building, even if it's just for yourself. I paused, looking toward the water. This land was never meant to be a business deal. It was meant to be a place where something good can grow. So today, we begin the Light on the Lake Foundation. Its first purpose will be to fund programs that support women in their later years, training housing assistants. Whatever gives us back some control in a world that often forgets we exist. More nods now. One woman whispered something to another and wiped her cheek with a tissue. I'm not handing this over to someone else's legacy. I'm keeping it where it belongs, with those of us who still believe in second chances, no matter how old we are. Applause rose soft at first, then louder. It wasn't the kind of applause that echoed. It settled deep like a warm coat pulled tight on a cold day. After the ceremony, we shared soup and cornbread. A few brought baked goods wrapped in tinfoil. There was laughter. There were stories. We weren't young, but in that moment we were bold, whole. The lake sat quiet, bearing witness. I didn't think about Miles or Trina. Not once. Because that day wasn't about who wasn't there. It was about who chose to be. And I had finally chosen myself. It was a quiet Thursday morning when I saw the headline. The local paper sat folded in two on the porch bench, dropped off by sweet old Marlene like she did every week. I didn't expect anything newsworthy. The reports about the new school board or the winner of the pie contest at the fair were the same most of the time. However, Trina's name appeared today, on the first page. It was not a nice headline. Trina Brenner's lakefront proposal fails due to community opposition and a lack of funds. I read it slowly, time and again. A picture of Trina from a month ago, taken at a Chamber of Commerce conference, was located beneath the headline. She maintained the same flawless stance and half smile that was ready for the camera. However, she strangely appeared smaller in black and white, far away. Although brief, the essay was comprehensive. It described how insufficient private funding was obtained for a projected boutique lakeside hideaway, how people of the community voiced concerns over the property's history of dishonesty, environmental effect, and land ethics. Town residents provided quotes. According to one, it never seemed to be intended for humans. "I'm glad the land stayed where it belongs," another person commented simply. After carefully folding the paper, I put it back on the bench and entered. I didn't feel victorious. There was silence, no flush of triumph, and maybe a subliminal reminder that my decisions, even if they were hidden, had an impact. I took a stroll around the lake later that day. The breeze was light, with a hint of sweetness and the smell of pine. The ground felt soft beneath my feet because it had rained the previous evening. For a time, I watched the water lap at the shoreline from the edge. Stable, not ferocious, not rushed. Miles hadn't given a call. Trina was nowhere to be seen. I doubted that they ever would. Oddly enough, though, that concept no longer bothered me. I had waited for individuals to become the person I wanted them to be for a large portion of my life. Perhaps it wasn't losing them to let go. Perhaps they were simply realizing who they had always been. I went inside, made a cup of tea, and took a seat in the window-facing recliner. It was the same one where I read to the children when they were young. I grabbed a blank page in my journal and scrawled one phrase across the top: "Please don't erase me." Then I grinned and put the pen down. Nor resentful, nor arrogant, simply whole. For a long time, I kept the small mirror in the drawer. It had a thin, yard sale type wooden frame with wear along the edges. Nothing noteworthy. However, I put it on the tea table next to my favorite chair the morning after the story was published. It was cool and clear that morning. Outside the window, the lake glistened like glass. Wrapped in the old green shawl Jack had given me for our anniversary, I sat with my customary cup of lemon tea. There was still a little cedar scent. In order to catch my reflection in the light, I tilted the mirror. Lips squeezed together, eyes gentle, face in alignment. Not with sorrow, but with silent comprehension. Since then, I've glanced in the mirror every morning, not to see how old I've become or to check my hair, to ask myself a straightforward question, not aloud, but quietly. Did I live a truthful life today? Did I present myself as I would have liked others to? Though it hasn't always been the case, the response is now more frequently than not yes. Peace has returned to the house. There is no longer a void in the stillness. It has breath. It provides room for memories and fresh starts. The land is now something to share rather than something to defend. These days, the women who come here have their own tales to tell about losing themselves, reinventing themselves, and returning to who they are. Miles hasn't given a call. Trina is no longer present at town events. I hear murmurs, but I don't bend to listen. That is no longer my tale. Rather, I've discovered a rhythm in the silence. Tea and the mirror in the mornings. Women are being taught how to handle modest grants, read contracts, and safeguard their property in the afternoons. I could never get the sound of the lake's lap on the rocks out of my head. I wouldn't have believed it if you had told me years ago that I would find comfort in being remembered by strangers rather than by my kids. However, sometimes the smallest mirror reflects the greatest truth, and other times tranquility appears in unexpected places. You're never invisible. All you have to do is wait for the proper people to notice you, beginning with yourself. I hope Esther's journey served as a reminder that it's never too late to take back your space if you've ever felt undervalued or ignored in your own tale. Making a graceful and silent decision for oneself might occasionally be the greatest gesture of love. Please share your comments if this tale resonated with you or caused you to think about yourself. You are not alone in this, and your voice counts.